This is case number 113267, Luke Gannon et al., Appalese v. State of Kansas, appellant. I will now ask counsel to state their appearances for the record.
Steve McAllister, along with co-counsel Art Chalmers and Attorney General and several members of the office here for the State of Kansas.
The Appalese, Alan Root, John Robb, and Jessica Skladzy.
Very well. For the benefit of the audience, not only in our packed courtroom, but also people who would be watching these proceedings being streamed live over the internet, I'm going to read part of a paragraph from our order of April 18, 2016, which explains in a little more detail why we are here today. The parties are ordered to appear at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, May 10, 2016, to show cause why the court should or should not rule that the legislation complies with Gannon 2's equity ruling regarding Article 6. Because of the burden placed on the state, it will argue first and will be allowed 60 minutes for oral argument. It may reserve a portion of its time for rebuttal. Appellees will also be allowed 60 minutes for oral argument. For the benefit of our audience and counsel, I will tell you that the court intends to take a break before the appellees will make their argument, and I understand the state will also be requesting some rebuttal time. Before we proceed with the arguments, I did want to make two brief announcements. As you can see, Justice Beyer is once again recused on the Gannon litigation. Sitting in for her is the distinguished jurist to my left. This is the Honorable David Stutzman. He is a district judge in Riley County. And as you may recall, he sat with the court on Gannon 1 and on Gannon 2. To my far left, sitting in for Justice Caleb Stegall, who is also recused, this is the Honorable Mike Malone. He is a senior judge assigned to the Kansas Supreme Court. Both of these jurists will be working on this case until its final resolution. And I did want to thank Judge Stutzman and Judge Malone for helping out the Supreme Court on this important matter. Does counsel have any preliminary matters?
No, Your Honor.
Very well, counsel, you may proceed.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, I am Steve McAllister, and along with my co-counsel Art Chalmers, I represent the state of Kansas. With the court's permission, I would like to reserve 15 minutes for rebuttal.
15 minutes is granted.
Thank you. Today, the only issue before the court is whether the state has complied with the equity requirement that this court has identified as part of Article 6 of the Kansas Constitution. The issue is further narrowed because the plaintiffs agree, as they must, that the legislature adopted the so-called safe harbor for capital outlay equalization aid, adopting the old formula and fully funding it. So that's no longer even a potential issue. Ultimately, a very important question this morning is whether this court meant what it said in both Gannon 1 and Gannon 2 when it expressly declared that there are a variety of ways the legislature could cure the equity issue. The legislature took the court at its word, and that led to the enactment of HB 2655. Before I talk a little bit about what exactly 2655 did, I would like to set just a little bit the context. Recall that, first of all, in both houses, bills were introduced that would have done what the plaintiffs now claim is required to be done, would have simply revived both of the old formulas and fully funded them. No one, including the plaintiffs, supported those bills.
That point was made several times in the material that you supplied us, but it doesn't, I wonder if that's a fair comparison, because there was no hold harmless in the House bill, as there was in the law that was ultimately passed. And in your brief, you also say that had there not been a hold harmless in the House bill that did pass, that it wouldn't have passed. So why should we look at, what was it, House Bill 2731 that went to 81.2 percentile but didn't have any hold harmless for those districts that were adversely affected? Why should we look at that as apples to apples?
Well, everything here, Your Honor, with all due respect, is a bit apples to oranges to pineapples to bananas. There's a lot of moving parts with all of these formulas. What I would say, though, is the plaintiffs could have been proponents of that bill. It would have given them exactly what they wanted, and yet they chose not to. They were not going to suffer for lack of hold harmless funding. So there's no reason they could not have supported the legislation.
Well, they may not have wanted to cannibalize their other districts. It seemed to be. I mean, that's been an issue in school finance. Is whether
always,
certain plaintiffs are arguing for a piece of somebody else's pie, or are they arguing for a piece of pie that doesn't adversely affect any school district?
It's almost always an issue, Your Honor, and almost inherently so when we're talking about equity, because equity is not about whether there's $450 in the system or $4.5 billion in the system. Equity is how that gets distributed, and one option, which the legislature tried and tries generally not to do, is to cannibalize. But the plaintiffs not only did not support either of those bills, they didn't offer any alternative suggestion. I mean, all they have ever offered to this court or to the legislature is to go back to the so-called safe harbor for both capital outlay and LOB. If the legislature, you're right, had pursued HB 2731, or I think it's Senate Bill 515, the evidence shows there would have been about 101 districts worse off, about 45 equal, and about 140 who would have benefited. But in an equity game, that's almost always the situation, unless there's some huge new source of money, because you're just trying to equalize, and that doesn't mean what the plaintiffs want is it always has to be this, but equity does not reasonably, in logic or law, require this. It could be this, it could be something in between. Here the legislature was working in a tough budget year with constraints and chose not to pursue that option because they found no support, not even by the plaintiffs, for those options.
The thing I didn't understand, in your brief, you use as an example for House Bill 2731, and I guess probably the Senate bill, even though the Senate bill took 1.45% from everybody to fund it. But focusing on the 2731, you drew attention to the Fort Scott School District, and you said, well, look at that, they would have lost $111,000. But under the law that you're coming here with, Fort Scott loses $430,000 in equalization aid.
And then,
but they lose. I mean, the $110,000 they lost, but in the law that you're advocating for now, they lose $430,000. How does that make sense?
well, it might not, except for, well, let me say this. There are lots of ways the legislature could equalize. And one is to make some school districts worse off, while at the same time making others better off. There's nothing inherently different from, again, if you pull one down and raise one, you pull it all down. These are choices the legislature had to make. Fort Scott's just one example. You can find a district that will suit just about any hypothetical here with 286 of them. Under the law as enacted, there are over 20 who are actually better off than even under SB 7. So in that sense, some districts are better off. Furthermore, as a whole, the legislature put $2 million more directly into equalization aid that was not there before. It also put $15 million in the Extraordinary Needs Fund with the direction that it intended and hoped that the State Board of Ed would use that money to address equity concerns. Furthermore, the legislature showed its work, more so here than with SB 7, to give this court a record on which to evaluate its efforts to satisfy equity. And also, I would remind the court that the plaintiffs talk about in their brief that the legislature paid no attention to adequacy. That's absolutely false. The hold harmless funding addresses adequacy because they didn't take a dime out of the system that was there when they started. So they did have an eye on adequacy as they tried to make adjustments for equity. Even if some of the mill levy disparity, if we go to Mr. Penner's chart, which both parties have argued about, but was there, it was in front of the legislature, the numbers, the mill levy disparity, and this gets back to what standard we're arguing to. So reasonably equal access to substantially similar educational opportunities through similar tax effort. The mill levy disparity has gone down significantly over the last 3 years. Now, plaintiffs may want to say that's all due to changes in property values. APP goes up and down. Well, that may be true, but it doesn't change the fact that the legislature knew the disparity for this coming year under HB 2655 was going to be less than it had been in any of the preceding 3 years. And the legislature should be allowed to take that into account in deciding what kind of a scheme they want to set up for the coming year. So
How do
In
you
addition-
respond to the plaintiff's argument in their brief that the Penner graph distorts the picture because it uses quintile averaging, but when you look at their attachment, which shows the actual range of mill levies between real school districts, I think the range was something like 5 mills to 40 or 50. That's a significant difference, seems to me. So anyway, what's your response?
Well, Your Honor, I think the response is no one has yet come up with a perfect way to make sure every district is exactly equal. Even under the plaintiff's version, there are blips up and down from the line that they say is the goal. It's almost impossible to avoid because the system is so complicated. And the other thing that doesn't really match up here is part of this is based on average or assessed value per pupil, but part of this also relates to LOB. The cap for LOB depends on weighted student count, whereas AVPP is just actual student bodies, and there's a somewhat of a disconnect between these two things, and that accounts for, on the chart that we provided, or even the one they provided, some of those blips are differences between AVPP for a particular district and its actual LOB situation given its weighted student enrollment. And what I would suggest is the chart we provided does 3 things that are very important for the court to consider. One, the plaintiffs would like you to look at the red line just going towards infinity, but that doesn't happen. With the LOB cap, that can't happen. So they say, oh, well, that's only the upper end, but that's the point. It holds down the upper end of the school districts, that top quintile, significantly to keep the band of disparity much narrower. The second thing the plaintiffs argue is ignore the hold harmless because it has a disequalizing effect. Well, that's simply false as a matter of math. Mr. Penner's chart that shows the disparities includes hold harmless funding. If you take hold harmless out, those disparities get bigger, not smaller. So and it makes sense if you think about where the hold harmless funding comes from. It came from the SB7 equalization formulas. So that aid in itself was calculated as equalization aid. It wasn't being taken from some other source, it was equalization aid. So it does, in fact, improve equalization. So they want to ignore those factors. And if you look at the chart we gave you, granted, it's not perfect. We don't have a straight line going across. I mean, there is some of this, but there is plenty of that with their line as well. And the question, I think, from a constitutional standpoint, I hope it's not the state has to achieve perfection, because we never will. It's just not possible. I don't think it's too complicated. But that within some reasonable band, and maybe that's what we're arguing about, what's a reasonable disparity? If the goal in the test is 0 disparity, that won't be accomplished. But if the test is under 3 mils, under 4 mils, under 1 mil, well, I think we can argue that we're within a band that is constitutionally acceptable here. And in fact, as Mr. Penner's analysis shows, you can get less than 1 mil disparity at a relatively typical LOB, 29%, if the extraordinary need funds are utilized in the way the legislature intends. then at least between the top 20 and the bottom 20, you will get less than 1 mil disparity. And part of the reason the legislature has focused on that part of the equity test, again, reasonably equal access to substantially similar educational opportunity with similar tax effort. The one thing anybody can quantify here is the mil level disparity. So to some extent, that's what they focused on, because that's the part they could quantify. They had
What's a reasonable disparity in your mind? Just what this 2655 provides, or is there some other test we should apply or some other tolerance we should look at?
Well, Your Honor, with all due respect, it's not my test. The court says a similar tax
No, I understand.
effort.
It
And
just-
so
what would you argue would be a?
I would
understand
think, I can't pick a specific number, but if the court, I will say this, if the court thought disparity under SB 7 was too much, although I'm not sure if it said it's too much or we don't have enough evidence of how the legislature got here to evaluate that. But if you assume that was too much, I think that's 5 point something. We're significantly below that now. And again, it doesn't really matter why. The legislature knew that was the end result if they adopted 2655. And so I'm not saying 5 is a magic number, but if you use SB 7 as a reference point, we're certainly lower than that. And we're certainly way lower than we were a few years ago prior to HB 2506 and Gannon 1. Way lower. That was double digits at that point in time.
Historically,
Sorry, go ahead.
in addition to the mill levy disparity, we've looked at the equalization point. Is that not a valid measure?
Well, I think it's one way, but again, if the court said there are a variety of ways, and I would disagree with the plaintiff's notion that Montoy somehow constitutionalized a particular level. I tried to find in their brief, they cite Montoy, sometimes we disagree on the way we refer to it. I call it the last Montoy, whether it's 4 or 5. The pages they cite saying 75% was not good enough constitutionally, I can't find that discussion. In fact, it's Justice Rosen's concurring opinion in the last Montoy. It's not the majority, and I didn't see anywhere that he actually talks about the 75%. So it is one way. The state has done it, but there's got to be, if the court meant what it said, there's a variety of ways. There's no reason it has to be on a percentile basis.
But isn't it a significant measure? Isn't it an objective way for us to see how school districts across the spectrum are being affected by the equity formula?
Well, except that the 81.2 itself is arbitrary, 75 is arbitrary. I mean, one could pick any level and say we want to equalize to this level, and the testimony in front of the legislature, and many of them probably know this firsthand, was part of the reason we got to 81.2 was in Montoy. The court says there needs to be more money in the system. The legislature said, how much can we come up with, and then let's just pick a number that we think will fit with the funds available. I mean, the testimony was clear that no expert, no educational policy says you have to equalize in that way or that any particular number is the equalizing number. And I would say, Your Honor, if you think about it, what Mr. Penner has done comparing bottom 20 with top 20, the quintiles, is not really that far off in some ways from the 81%, because the 81%, it is the bottom 4 quintiles, but it's still the top 20 is the comparison point. And we're just saying, there should be a band there that is perhaps wider than the plaintiffs think, but still not very wide.
But the measurement is different in that, again, we're looking at numbers of school district versus mill levy. And would you agree that we dropped from 81.2 to 68.8%?
No. In fact, the only way the plaintiffs get that number is to ignore the effect of the Extraordinary Needs Fund if it's used to equalize, and they ignore the effect of hold harmless. In fact, if you include those two things, I'm not sure if it's 81.2, but I think it's well over 75. It will be approaching the 81.2. So they get the 68 only by ignoring those two things, which can't be ignored. They're in the system. They are funds that are directed to the schools that have an equalizing effect.
So if we can deduce from Montoy 4 or 5, whichever number we're talking about, that at 75% was not a sufficient equalization, you're back to that number? Is that your argument?
I think, I can't say I know the exact number. I have seen it. I believe it's between the 75 and the 81.2, but I don't know the exact number. I think it's above the 75. And again, you know, Montoy didn't say 81.2 was required. It just said when the legislature got to that point, that's good enough. We don't know if 78 would have been a good enough, 77, 79. Again, I don't think the court constitutionalized a particular level in terms of the percentile there.
You said, counsel, that the 75 percentile number, which is the way the formula worked in 1992 when it was passed, was an arbitrary number. But in the USD 229 case, it was specifically found to have a rational basis. And the rational basis was formed on a notion of, first of all, this concept of equalization was known as a guaranteed tax base. And then when you looked at the 75th percentile, you could see how many kids in Kansas got the benefit of that guaranteed tax base. And then you compared that to other states as to how much they provided for the same population. And all of that made Kansas look pretty good. And so both the district court found that it had a rational basis, and that was affirmed on appeal. So I don't think it was arbitrary.
Well, not arbitrary in that sense. I mean, the 81.2 is rational in that sense, Your Honor. I mean, but so would 77, so would 74, so would 78. I mean, what I'm saying is there's no justification for a particular number. There may be a justification, certainly rational, for taking that approach to equalization. But I come back to, again, this court has said twice, there's more than one way to equalize here. So, you know, it's not apparent why the Constitution or reason requires necessarily retaining that particular approach to equalization. And here the legislature heard evidence also, if you want to compare to other states, for example, there was evidence they heard that Kansas, in fact, is pretty high up in the tier of states in terms of direct state aid, not the LOB portion of the budget, but the base portion. Kansas provides a higher percentage of school districts' budget centrally than many states do. So there are a lot of factors here that the legislature tried to take into account. And I would say, you know, in comparison to when we were here last time on SB 7, which I think also had a rational basis, the court didn't find it satisfactory from an equity standpoint, but it certainly had a rational basis. What the court did not have, perhaps, is as much clear evidence of what the legislature actually had in front of it to consider. Here, it's not just people opining that they think this would be a good or a bad idea. In fact, you have the Legislative Research Department saying, here are numbers you can look at. And if you take this approach, here's what happens to the mill level disparity, which again is the one objective thing that the legislature could come back to, because I don't want to fail to mention the other part of the equity test, the substantially similar educational opportunity, no one could define. I mean, the experts were asked, district superintendents, people from the State Board of Ed, whoever, everyone who came in front asked, how do you measure substantially similar educational opportunity? So, well, we don't really know. You know, we're going to have to wrestle with that when we get to adequacy and the Rose factors, because we're not sure what they mean. And we're not sure what is substantially similar educational opportunity. So the legislature had evidence that the schools on the whole, Kansas does well by many measures. So rationally, you could conclude that across the board, on the whole, there is reasonably equal access to substantially similar educational opportunity. That part, no one knew how to evaluate who appeared in front of the legislature. So the part they could evaluate was the similarity of tax effort. And that became the focal point. And the similarity of tax effort, again, I'll probably say it more times than you want me to hear it, but it's the lowest it's been in the last 3 years, and it is significantly less than it was when we came up here in Gannon 1. It's now, you know, again, if the extraordinary needs funds are utilized for equalization purposes, we could get that down below 1 mil. And it seems to me whatever the constitutional standard is, below 1 mil ought to satisfy it.
Counsel, I've been trying to figure out how to wrestle with this part of our function as an appellate court. You know, there wasn't anything in the record that you produced that indicated that Mr. Penner's quintile analysis was an appropriate way of analyzing a school finance issue. And the plaintiffs have challenged it. Y'all may have good points on either side, but I don't think as an appellate court we can resolve that. I mean, I think that's a trial court type of function. But for purposes of what we're trying to do here and deciding whether the state has met its burden, what do we do with Mr. Penner's analysis? Because it seems to be capable of criticism.
Well, it might be, and I'm sure the plaintiffs would say it definitely is, Your Honor. But, you know, another way to look at that, I suppose, even if one is not confident about the quintile division, if you look at what Mr. Penner has done, and in particular you look at what we provided in the motion to strike, and you compare all of the quintiles. So I'll just take what was originally produced and just give you this example. So for 2016, 2017, so we're talking about the difference between wealthiest 20% and poorest 20% being 3.148. But the difference between wealthiest 20% and the second poorest 20% is 1.8. It's less. If we take the difference between the wealthiest 20% and the middle percent, the 40 to 60%, it's 0.4. So the only one that has more disparity than the 3.148 is actually the wealthiest 20% to the 60 to 80%. So in a sense, there's even stronger equalizing effect between the 20 to 60% compared to the wealthiest 20% than there is the wealthiest to the poorest. So we were arguing for him a number in some ways that was not the most favorable number we could have presented.
If that's a valid measure of effort and equalization. And so it's the validity of the test that I don't think we can, you know, without the ability to compare it to, well, this is what's used all over, because I'm not aware of it being used, and you haven't cited us to any way that methodology has been used. So again, it gets back to, we can look and see what the numbers say, but the method that was used to arrive at those numbers, it seems to me hard for us to give any credibility to one way or the other.
Your Honor, we have to choose something. Again, I don't think there's a scientific or a recognized standard. I mean, the other way, I suppose, is do every single school district and you do this. But
you could do a correlation between the spending of the school districts and wealth. That's been used in several of these Kansas cases.
Well, again, I would say the quintiles, if the plaintiffs don't like wealthiest 20%, poorest 20%, if you look across the spectrum, what I'm suggesting is they may be like this. When you get in the middle, it's like this. Now the next wealthiest is there's a little more, actually it's this way, a little more disparity. But it's a pretty good line across, and again, you were talking earlier about rational basis, and the question would be, is it irrational for the legislature to rely on such a scheme? And I would respectfully say no, it's rational. It is some measure, some sense of the disparity that's going on across the spectrum. And so the legislature could reasonably conclude on the basis of that evidence that the disparity is much improved from what it was 3 years ago, 2 years ago, even a year ago. And again, I would come back to the other piece of this that plaintiffs don't want the court to consider or to view as a negative, in fact, is a positive, which is the hold harmless aid. Because the hold harmless aid itself is equalization aid under SB 7, so it was being, in essence, calculated on an equalization basis. If it is taken out of the picture, the mill levy disparities become greater. So it actually does have an equalizing effect. It also has an important adequacy effect, because if they took that 61 million out of the system altogether and said, here's our new formulas, this is how we equalize, then we'd probably be hit with an adequacy argument that you've cut the overall school budget by 61 million. Instead, legislature kept that in there. So from an adequacy standpoint, there's not one dime less in the system than there was before.
Does the state concede that using the capital outlay equalization formula for LOB purposes is inappropriate?
Is inappropriate?
Yes, because the only way you get to adequacy and to better equality, better equity, is to add in the hold harmless and add in the emergency needs or whatever that extra pot of money is. But just standing alone, cutting $83 million out of the equalization aid would not be appropriate.
Well, I guess that's a hypothetical, Your Honor, in terms of that's not what happened.
It absolutely is what happened, Counsel. Because you look
Well,
at your spreadsheets, and $83 million went from equalization aid over to hold harmless. And when I look in your materials, it says that the purpose of the hold harmless is not to produce equity. The purpose is to produce budget stability. So in my mind, it looks like the legislature believes that the capital outlay formula appropriately equalizes LOB funds.
And it certainly could, Your Honor.
How?
I mean, well, again, equalization is not a function of how much money is in the system. It's about it being equitably distributed. So if everyone operates under the same formula, that in and of itself would be equitable. But I would also take issue with your notion that their only purpose was to stabilize school budgets. The legislature also that was a purpose. I don't argue with that. But it was also recognized in the legislature that the hold harmless funds would have an equalizing effect. But yes, I'd still be up here defending this. I think if you took that 61 million out, we had these two formulas, I realize I'd confront a larger mill levy disparity than I do, but there's simply no reason why LOB has to be calculated in a particular way, particularly the old way of doing it. There's no reason capital outlay has to be calculated the way it is, but what the legislature said was the court has blessed that capital outlay formula. The court has not necessarily blessed a particular way of calculating LOB.
Counselor, if you look at the order, it said that the capital outlay system by structure and implementation has to accomplish the test. I hear you arguing that we've approved the structure of the capital outlay, but how do you justify its implementation in the LOB? You understand what I'm saying?
Well, I think so.
Just so the formula wasn't all we approved or directed the legislature to do. We said come up with the formula, and that has to also satisfy equity when it's implemented.
Right, and there is a difference, Your Honor. I certainly acknowledge that. And the capital outlay is, the way I think of it, is basically school district raises X, they're entitled to Y in state equalization. The total is X plus Y, so it just gets added on. LOB, the difference which the legislature confronts is there is a cap on LOB. So LOB can never be more than a certain amount for any particular district. So the more state aid there is, the only thing that can happen basically is the district can lower its tax burden, but it can never generate more money. So I recognize they operate differently. But again, the legislature, asked expert after expert, is there a reason for a particular formula here? And the answer that came back was this is basically the result of political compromise over time, court decisions that said more money, but not that a particular formula had to be used. And they were, I think, in some sense, looking for a safe harbor formula, if you will, and saying this court had said, and I understand your point that you're saying formula plus the way it actually plays out in practice, and there is some difference
It has to
there.
result in equity.
And again,
Correct? I mean, you agree that it has to result in
result in equity, but Your Honor, I was going to make this point to Justice Bowles, and I forgot. The plaintiffs would have you just strip it all out and say it's just the LOB. But just as this court said with adequacy, you have to look at the system as a whole. I mean, you can isolate a part of the system and say, well, that piece doesn't really achieve equity. But that's not how the legislature came at this, nor should it under the Constitution. They said, does the whole system, at the end of the day, produce equity? And again, I come back to Mr. Penner's chart. In the legislature's view, the whole system, the hold harmless aid, the new LOB formula, the old capital outlay formula fully funded, results in a mill levy disparity that is lower than it's been in the last 3 years. That, in the legislature's view, rationally and reasonably was equity. So I don't disagree. You could take pieces apart and argue about exactly how they work. The other thing I'd remind the court is this is basically a one-year solution. So the legislature, until Gannon 2 came out in February, I believe the plan was to work on a new funding formula. Gannon 2 required them to focus on equity this session. But this is, I'm not saying this is a for all time equitable fix. What I'm saying is for 2016, 2017, this is a constitutional fix.
But counsel, this case comes to us after 3 trips to the district court and 2 trips on appeal, which the state has lost each time. And going back over the findings of fact in this case, the system has operated unconstitutionally and on basis of equity since the fiscal year 2010 formula, if I read Gannon 1 right. And we're talking about fiscal year 2017. At what point does this process have to stop?
Well,
how many years do we operate unconstitutionally before we say, the music's got to stop and we got to quit dancing?
Well, Your Honor, a couple things about that. Certainly the state's view was this should have never started as a case. It is a political question. This court disagreed with that. I think what you're touching upon is one of the difficulties here. I do think the legislature here acted in good faith in a tough budget year, trying to do what it can for a whole lot of reasons. There are constraints that may not be legal, but they're there. And this is the problem that many states have experienced. That I was rereading an article Professor Levy wrote after the Montoy litigation, and he sort of describes it as, well, some states go on for years and years trying to figure this out between the courts and the legislature. Some state Supreme Courts simply give up because it's just sort of an intractable problem. And one of the problems is it's a constantly moving target. Nothing stays the same from year to year. The AVPPs change, all what the LOB that the district may levy can change, the capital outlay they levy may change. All of this is moving pieces. So, my view is this, I guess, from the state standpoint. Let's conclude that for 2016, 2017, what HB 2655 does is achieve equity for the coming year. We don't know what's coming after that, except what we do know is we have the adequacy part of the case yet to be decided, stayed currently, and we know the legislature seriously intends to revamp or revise, certainly revisit the overall formula next session. And I don't know where that will leave us, but at this point in time, the state would ask that the court find that HB 2655 achieves equity for 2016, 2017, and let us go on to the adequacy part of the case, and then we'll see what happens in the 2017 legislative session. And I'm sorry that doesn't necessarily mean a clear or clean conclusion to all of this, but I think that's the nature of school finance litigation. Once we're into it, it's extremely difficult because neither the court nor the legislature can turn on a dime instantly and make things happen. And in the meantime, the circumstances, financially and otherwise, are changing every single year. And
do I understand, counsel, that under the law that's in front of us today, that there remains, under the LOB, local revenue raising authority for school districts? That's the backfill.
Right.
And under this formula, if a school district raises local dollars, is any of that equalized?
Well, under this formula, it's equalized to the extent is, so I think what the plaintiffs are arguing is there may be some districts who, getting less LOB aid, can backfill with additional, they can raise additional funds. I don't think you get any more than what this formula already says. One of the problems with that argument, though,
So are they wrong? There's no ability to raise additional money? I thought you just said there would be.
there would be some for
And
districts.
is that, and if those additional dollars are raised, whatever they are those dollars equalized?
I'm not sure, actually, I'll find out.
And if they aren't, then doesn't that create a problem like we had in, I'm gonna say Montoy 3, but that's the one where the legislature tried to fix and it was rejected. So whichever number that one is. Because in that case, the legislature had authorized raising the cap from, I think, 25 to 27%, and that 2% wasn't equalized, and the court rejected that, saying you can't have any more unequalized dollars floating around in this system. So isn't that the same problem?
If that's the way it could happen under this system, it is a similar problem. Again, the question at this point would be how much, and we just don't know if that really. I think there was suggestion that that's not likely huge amounts of money because many of the districts that could raise LOB are probably already at their cap, so they don't have room to maneuver anyway. I mean, the other problem is some of the districts that are perhaps less wealthy, they're making a choice. Even the plaintiffs say, well, political reasons, they choose not to raise mill levy. Well, they could raise more funds. They're choosing not to.
That's because it's harder for poor districts to raise dollars when they don't have the same mill levy or the same assessed valuation per pupil. It is a harder function. So of course they're going to be burdened by that. But that's what I'm trying to get at.
Right, but what I'm trying to say is there's a political aspect too, that you may have some districts where the people simply say, we don't want to pay any more taxes for our schools. So, there's a certain irony here that the school district that in some sense refuses to raise what it could, then just turns to the state to fill that in and say, well, the state's got to give us more money because our people, it's not necessarily they can't raise taxes, they don't want to raise taxes. Other districts, and I don't think it's just, the plaintiffs would have you believe it's just Blue Valley or Shawnee Mission. I don't think those are the only districts in the state who are willing to raise taxes to fund their schools. So it's not just a wealthy versus poor problem. But your question also leads me to something I wanted to mention before my time runs out here, Justice, which is if this court finds any aspect of 2655 to be constitutionally unacceptable, and I'm certainly not urging that you do. To the contrary, I think it is constitutionally acceptable. But if you find something is not, the state would articulate, excuse me, 4 principles the court should adhere to and consider in developing any remedy. The first principle is that the schools should be open in August. No one, except apparently the plaintiffs now, wants to close the schools. There's no reason for the court to strike the entire funding system. We're in a very different posture than we were with SB 7. SB 7 had a non-severability clause. HB 2655 basically repeals that and says anything in this law is severable. We've already all agreed that the capital outlay funding is constitutional as currently constituted. Many of these schools have reserve funds. The base state aid sort of thing, that's not being challenged in this part of the appeal. The only thing conceivably that would be a problem in the plaintiff's view under HB 2655 is LOB. So if there's something to do with LOB, then do something about LOB. But there's
Functionally, how would that work?
Well, there are a couple of ways.
I mean, if you're asking, I know you're not asking us to do that, but
No.
if we employ, I understand. If we employ the severance mechanism, how would that work? We would strike the general state aid through the LOB. We would strike that portion and do what?
Well, I think you have options. One option, which may or may not be palatable, would be to strike the state equalization, leaving the LOB mechanism in general in place. I realize that would have disequalizing effects, but at least the districts would have access to those LOB funds. Another option, and I'm not advocating any of these, would be to if push came to shove and we have to take the whole LOB system, that would be preferable to taking the entire system. Because in the interim, the legislature, they'll be back for sure next spring. Schools can open in August with their base funding, with their reserves, with their capital outlay funding. They can open and operate for some significant period of time. There's no reason, if LOB is the only problem, to do a remedy, to enter a remedy that does more than address LOB. So principle number one, keep the schools open in August. Principle number two, which came through loud and clear in the legislative record, is the school districts, including the plaintiffs, all would like to have budgeting stability. So a remedy that does not suddenly remove lots of funds from some districts. Three, any remedy, and this is just judicial tradition, should be narrowly tailored to do minimum harm to students and schools. And four, which I think is very important, is to minimize interbranch conflict. Any remedy should certainly respect and maintain fundamental separation of powers issues. And typically that has meant, if there is a problem, to declare something unconstitutional, possibly to enjoin the operation of some aspect of law. It has never included what the plaintiff suggests, which is appropriating money. We will no longer have a separation of powers if that is the remedy here. That just can't be an answer. It's not been an answer that I'm aware of in any state. It's never been an answer in the federal system. One could look long and hard for a U.S. Supreme Court decision appropriating money, and it would be a fool's errand because there is no such decision. That's not the way to go. It's not the way this court has ever gone.
Let me ask you about this. The nice thing about changing the severability clause is that I assume you would agree with this, but tell me, is that we're now on more comfortable ground in terms of past case law, because I don't think we've ever had a case where the legislature said, you have to kill everything, including yourselves, if you declare this unconstitutional. So now we're into our traditional test. And I'm assuming that if we don't accept the equalization for the LOB, that both the equalization aid and the authority to raise LOB dollars has to go. If what we're doing here is equity, we can't allow local revenue raising and not the equalization part. So apply the test for me. So now we don't have LOB. And if my math's right, and the numbers, and before you leave, I want to ask you about some numbers, because I want to make sure before we're done today, we agree on a set of numbers. But if I'm looking at this right, LOB has about $610 million of locally raised money. And if I give you credit for the hold harmless, don't give you credit for the extra need stuff because we don't know what's going to happen there, but I give you credit for the hold harmless. We've got about $450 million of equalization aid. So that's nearly $1.1 billion. So the first part of our test is, would the legislature have passed class without the LOB? And it isn't the question whether the legislature would have passed class with $1 billion, almost $1.1 billion out of it. So and that's the first question, right?
Well, I think that's, now you're going back to
That's just traditional severability. That's the first
class, but
question.
I certainly think the answer is with the severability clause now, and I don't think you can go back to the intent at the time of class, because the intent in 2655 modifies that intent. So if you took the intent now, in hindsight, my answer would be, if the choice is 4.5 billion disappears, or 1.1 billion disappears, but 3.4 remains to open the schools in August, they would choose the latter. That the schools would open with the 3.4 billion in the education budget, and then obviously some things may have to happen, but that would be the choice.
That gets you to the second part of the severability test, which is whether public school funding could operate efficiently and effectively without that $1.1 billion. And how would you answer that?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, at least for a while. I mean, to be honest, I do not know all the details of how a school district might spend money, but they would have substantial funds available to open the school. They might have to move some things around. I don't know.
How are they going to raise tax? They don't have any authority to raise the 610 million.
No. I'm not saying
So
they could fill
that's
that
going to be
gap.
gone for a year.
That could be gone for a year, but what I'm saying is they would have two options, I guess, at a minimum. One would be to dramatically strip down and plan for a year without those funds. The other would be to operate, I guess they'd have three options. The other would be to strip down somewhat in anticipation that those funds will come in time to fill in the missing gap before the end of the year, or they could just start as usual and see how long those funds last. But the point would be 3.4, you've still got 3/4 of the funding. So as long as, and I do not know the answer to exactly, some of these funds may not be able to be used for certain purposes, but they could operate for a substantial portion of the school year, even with just the 3.4.
So let's assume that's one option. Excuse me, Chief, but I want to finish. Let's assume that's one option. But another option would be if there's no more money in the state treasury. So we can't spend any more. 450 is the number, and we can't go above it. Another option would be to dial down the budget raising authority of local school districts. So you could get to a better equalization formula. You could get to the safe harbor simply by taking the top down, right? So if that's a possibility, why should we make that choice now and not, under respect for separation of powers, hand that back to the legislature and say, do you want to add money to the treasury, from the treasury to solve the problem? Do you want to dial down the budget authority and keep your $450 million intact? Or do you want to take away the LOB? I mean, that seems to be more respectful of the separation of powers than us picking any of these options.
Well, at a certain level, I agree with you, Your Honor, that giving the legislature real choices and saying, here's the problem we see, here are choices we see, it's not for us to decide which way this goes, is respectful in a traditional way of the separation of powers, if they are real choices. I'm not sure if the choice is either do this or we shut down the schools, if that's a real choice for the legislature. And again, that's something actually Professor Levy talks about in his article. Sort of, is it coercive? If a court offers real choices to a legislature, that's probably within the traditional judicial function of crafting a remedy. If it's really, do this or we kill ourselves, as you said earlier, that's not really a choice, and that's almost the same as the court mandating a particular
But all
result.
we'd be doing is saying this law is invalid.
Right, and
And here are some
declarations.
choices to now figure it out.
Declarations are well within judicial remedial authority.
Are you
I'm
finished?
sorry, yeah,
No,
I'm
that's all right. To go back to a point, counsel, you made a few minutes ago, assuming that we did sever the supplemental general state aid and we severed the LOB authority to raise funds. I think Justice Biles pointed out, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. And my understanding is that if you said that is a possible ruling by this court, not that you agree with it, but it's something that we could do, the districts would remain open using whatever money comes in through other sources, and then would rely upon the legislature when it convenes in January to fix the problem.
I mean, that's,
My question is, my understanding, one of the very first comments you made here about a purpose of this particular law was to create budgeting certainty for school districts. So my question is, what do you tell superintendents for the 286 school districts, I think you said that's how many we have, how they possibly budget for this coming school year, knowing that hundreds of millions of dollars in LOB funds and the supplemental general state aid is uncertain?
it's difficult, and that's why I said one of the four principles the state would point to in crafting a remedy is trying to guarantee budgetary stability. If the court's remedy has a destabilizing effect, well, then that's going to be a problem for the schools. What I was saying is in HB 2655, of course, the legislature's of the belief that what it has done is constitutional, and the reason for adding the hold harmless funds back in is twofold. It's both to keep that budget stability, which was the whole idea of SB 7 and the 2-year budgeting, which I think many districts favored that idea of multi-year budgeting, but it was also to keep an eye on adequacy so as not to take any money out of the system that might create adequacy problems. So, I guess that's another way to think about it, Justice or Chief Justice, is that is not an attractive option to the state, but it is more attractive than striking down the entire system, because striking down the entire system basically necessarily creates a violation of adequacy. It'll be equitable. Nobody has any money, but zero funding for all schools can't possibly be adequate. So striking down the entire system is sort of contrary to what this court has said is a primary purpose of Article 6, because it would eliminate, at least for some period of time, education altogether. And zero funding cannot possibly be suitable provision for finance unless it's a very different world than the one we live in today.
Can the same be said if you remove hundreds of millions of dollars by severing the LOB and supplemental state aid provisions from this act? Is that perhaps creating an inadequacy itself?
Certainly could. I'm not saying that it is, but I mean, taking $1.1 billion out of the system might well raise adequacy questions.
That's about 25%.
But
is that correct?
25% might or might not, we might still argue about adequacy. 100%, I don't think there's any argument that it's not inadequate at that point.
Very well. Thank you, counsel. Do we have any further questions?
I have one. I want to take you back to half hour or so
Okay.
ago. You indicated that substantially similar educational opportunity was not amenable to measurement. Help me out here. What is it, the same educational opportunity if you have 100 students per class versus 20?
Well, first, I don't think that happens in any district.
Well,
but
no, I'm saying we're talking about a measurement tool, and
But-
why wouldn't the curricula that's offered, the class size, various factors that make that recognized as making a better educational opportunity, why isn't that a measurement of comparative opportunity?
Well, for one thing, I would maybe three answers to that, Your Honor. One is none of the experts said that was a measurement. They all said, we don't know how to measure it. Second of all, class size in and of itself is probably too simplistic. I mean, class size with a great teacher may handle a larger class better. With a poor teacher, could have a very small class and still not do a very good job. And there's nothing inherent about that tells you. And then the third thing I'd say is I would go back, just personal experience. I went to a school where my graduating class was 20. My kids go to a school where it's several hundred in a graduating class. Now, is my experience substantially similar from an educational standpoint to theirs? Well, it's different in some ways, but I don't think I was poorly educated. I got to play on the football team, be in the student council, do everything in a smaller school. I didn't have necessarily all the courses that my children can choose from. On the other hand, my children are not going to play on the football team or the basketball team. That's a problem in trying to compare across very different districts across the state of Kansas. I, for one, am not willing to say just because you have more kids in a classroom or because you're a smaller school with a smaller curriculum, you're not providing a substantially similar educational opportunity. And I think that's part of the problem. The experts just, at least at this point, did not offer the legislature any way to try to evaluate that piece of the test.
When you talk about experts, you're talking about Mike O'Neill and Dave Trabert, and the
No,
legislative research.
I mean, they testified, but I'm also talking about school superintendents, the executive directors, Kansas Association of School Boards. There were, Dale Dennis testified. I mean, there were a number of, I think there's 8 or 9 or 10 people.
But all those people didn't say that this was a test that could never be reached. I mean, you only had, in Montoy, they brought a guy out and did that exact analysis. Took several different school districts and compared what they were doing and looked at it, and we argued a lot about methodology in that. And but you know, the trial court made a determination of credibility and believability and did what they did.
Well, Justice Botts, certainly one can probably find an expert for just about anything, but what I'm saying is the people who are, very involved in Kansas education, who testified in front of the legislature to a person, said they didn't say it's impossible to measure necessarily, and if I said that, then I overstated it, but what they said is we don't know what that looks like. We don't know what the metric would be to evaluate that piece of the test.
So do we need to change our test? If the test is not amenable to measurement, then it's really not a test. So what I hear you say is the test is faulty.
I think the test is difficult to apply, Your Honor, at least that first part, but what I do think the most objective part of the test is the similar tax effort, and that is what the legislature focused on because it was, again, the most objective. They could sort of crunch numbers and get information and figure out what's the disparity look like. It's much harder to say how much difference, if any, of an educational opportunity districts are getting or giving with that disparity. So that part, I think, is more difficult.
I have some, go ahead, I'm sorry, Chief.
If I may. Kind of touching on what Justice Johnson was saying, and going back to your comment earlier that this is always a moving target. The pieces are always changing, and that you think that means it's not really amenable to any kind of judicial oversight, with which we've disagreed. But isn't that part of it, that even though you can't precisely maybe hold something up and say, well, it has to be this number of students, or it has to be this number of textbooks, because as you say, you can get to education in a lot of different ways and have it be a good education. But generally there's some agreement about what things are not good. And maybe you come at it from that direction. But with all the moving parts, it seems to me you've acknowledged that the disparity in fairness that existed pre-Gannon 1 was much greater, and I understood that to be your assertion now, that the inequity, the unfairness was much greater pre-Gannon 1 than you're saying it is right now today. So something has been achieved. It seems to me you're conceding by the process. So out of that is the message that it's then the work of the body who has to decide those things to come up with a mechanism that is attentive to these moving targets, both on the equity and adequacy side, so that there's some flexibility within reason to meet those standards.
Well, Your Honor, again, I think the state's fundamental view is that this really is legislative territory. But if I was to look at the history of school finance, your point, I think, is illustrated by Montoy. The legislature responded, the court said that's fine. The court released jurisdiction of the case. Then when events occurred, plaintiffs came back and filed another lawsuit saying they have not been sufficiently attentive from a constitutional perspective in making some of these changes, and this court has agreed with them. So that there is a...
So if a court doesn't hold them to being attentive, then How does that happen?
Well, I think that's part of the separation of powers and good faith trust in other branches. I just don't see a situation where it's beneficial for the court to say, for example, we're going to retain jurisdiction just in case the legislature 1 year, in our view, is not attentive to changes that will have a disequalizing effect. I mean, I just think it's the nature of the litigation that it has to end. There has to be trust and good faith. And I don't think even when the legislature did things post-Montoy that this court decided had a disequalizing effect, that those were done in bad faith. They were done as a result of economic circumstances and other pressures that the legislature felt. And I don't know if you're suggesting, I don't know if there's a way, I hadn't thought about that.
But doesn't it become then, isn't it always going to be the court's position to hold up the yardstick of the Constitution and say, is what's being done now in good faith? Does it measure up constitutionally? Isn't that always the court's role?
Well, that was certainly the model that New Jersey adopted, which I would not embrace.
Not saying continue one case forever, but at some point, if people have
That's
need
always-
recourse, isn't that the recourse?
That's always been the option in the last several years in Kansas, so that was why when the plaintiff said, let's reopen Montoy, and the state said, no, Montoy is done, and this court said, you're right, it's done. They initiated a new lawsuit. We can't prevent them from doing that. If we get to a point this court says is equity, then events occur down the road. Certainly the plaintiffs are entitled to challenge the way events have played out under this court's cases.
And this court has not maintained jurisdiction since USD 229, correct?
Right.
Which was in the early 90s. And then I think you indicated earlier, in Montoy, whether it's 5 or 6, I know we can disagree on that. This court said this litigation is over as far as the Supreme Court is concerned.
Yes.
And then when the plaintiffs came back later and said to the court, we want to reopen, and this court said no. So I'm not sure I'm understanding your concern that this court is going to keep jurisdiction over Gannon until we're at Gannon 14 or 15.
Well,
Are you just speaking hypothetically?
I certainly don't want to be here arguing Gannon 14 or 15, and maybe I misunderstood Judge Stutzman's question, but I thought perhaps he was asking if there was a way for the court to sort of continually monitor and be sure. But if he's just suggesting we decide there's compliance, they can always come back and file another lawsuit later.
And that was the
it's
suggestion.
okay. Well, then that's certainly the way it's worked in Montoy.
And I'm not sure where this notion of good faith, bad faith enters into the constitutional standard. Can you help me with that?
Well, all I'm saying, Your Honor, is I think one of the reasons you dismissed Montoy, I mean, I didn't have a vote, so I don't know, but one reason to dismiss Montoy rather than to retain jurisdiction indefinitely is a notion of good faith, that we have said, here's what's required, the legislature has satisfied us, we do not need to be in a position of sort of sitting over here ever ready to pick up this case again and evaluate what's happened week to week across the street. So that's the good faith that I'm talking about, that let the legislature proceed. If events change and the plaintiffs bring another lawsuit, then so be it.
Very well, thank you.
Except what happens when the good faith isn't fulfilled? I mean, that's what happened in Montoy. There was a 3-year plan that was passed. 2 of the years were the obligation was fulfilled. By the 3rd year, it wasn't. And
well, and I would disagree with your characterization, Justice, that I don't think it was good faith wasn't fulfilled. I think events made it hard to continue what the legislature had intended to do after Montoy.
well,
But what happens?
There was, I mean, promise after promise made. This is it. This is our fix. This is what we're going to do. And that's what induced us to dismiss it.
Right, but I guess you do what the plaintiffs did. If it has now resulted in a constitutional inequity or inadequacy, bring a new lawsuit to challenge it. But it's not to continue the jurisdiction of this court every year, just keeping an eye on things to make sure nothing has changed. I mean, that model has just never been very successful. There are states that have tried it, but that's why New Jersey has, I don't know, it's not Montoy, but like Montoy 24 or 25. It went on a long, long time.
I want to return to the LOB because I'm not sure I understand exactly your end point with this. And as I understand, we begin with your basic premise that we're looking at mill levy disparity, and that mill levy disparity is not very wide if we include both LOB equalization and hold harmless money. If that's true, why are we in any different situation than we were when we looked at this last time?
Okay, yeah, that that question I anticipated, Justice. So let me address that. Basically, we're in a different position because you've got $2 million more that has gone into equalization funding. So that's more. You've got the $15 million in extraordinary needs fund. Two things happen with that. Now, the legislature has expressed the intent that that should be used to equalize. That was not necessarily true before, and has given the authority to disperse it to the Kansas State Board of Education, which has monthly meetings, so it's year-round in operation, unlike the legislature, able to be more nimble in that sense in responding to needs. So you've got those two pieces, and at the end of the day, the hold harmless does have an equalizing effect. So we are better off with the hold harmless included than with it not included.
Do I understand these numbers to be, are these accurate? That the costs of the class LOB aid formula in FY17 would have been about $450.5 million.
I think that's correct.
That under 2655, they're down to 367,582, so that it's a difference of 82,908,792.
82 million.
82 million, I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah, a big difference there.
Well, it's a big difference, except then what happens is the 82 or 3, part of that goes to fully fund capital outlay. So capital outlay is fully funded under the old formula, and then the remainder basically goes into the hold harmless aid. So again, I come back to, at least from an adequacy standpoint, there's not a dime less in the system. It may be in different places, but there's not a dime less in the system than there was before under SB 7.
In essence, has equity improved only for those school districts receiving more money than they would have under class? Under your
No,
reasoning?
no, because again, one of the challenges is it may, and it does to some extent, appear that the money has moved around, but the total is the same. But again, if you come back to the mill levy disparity from last year to this year, it's significantly lower. And if the extraordinary need funds plus the $2 million added into equalization aid, if that's all used for equalization, the disparity probably goes below 1 mil, and that is lower than it was last year. Now the plaintiffs will say, well, that's largely a result of changes in property values. And that may be true, but the legislature was well aware of those changes in property values, and there's no logical reason why they can't say, look, this year the way the property values have switched, and with what we're doing in HB 2655, we're going to end up with a significantly smaller mill levy disparity. Now, if it had gone the other way, well, then they have to account for that. But if the system itself moves in an equalizing direction, there's no reason the legislature can't take that into account and say, well, we don't necessarily need to spend more money this year because we are now, at least and again, I'll come back to, I said equity for the coming year. That's what I'm arguing. For the coming year, we've satisfied the constitutional standard. After next year, lots of circumstances may change. I don't know. But for next year, we've gotten within what I hope is the constitutional range for equity on mill levy disparity.
Mr. Penner's analysis would have been the same before Gannon 2, wouldn't it?
In terms of?
Of this disparity and all that.
No,
I mean,
no.
maybe a little tiny bit because of your extraordinary needs fund, but the 450
But
was the same. I mean, it's the same number.
Same number, Your Honor, but the disparity would be different. So, I mean, if you took it back a year because the AVPP was different, those values were different. I mean, his chart shows the numbers under the first year of SB 7, and it's a larger disparity than this coming year. So, you know, if you moved him back a year, what he'd been projecting was that one that's 5 point something.
But you've got to use the same AVPP number with this calculation. But if you use that as the same, and you go right before Gannon 2, you're going to have the same number.
Well, I guess
as what he's shown.
are you talking about 15, 16, or 16, 17?
I'm talking about the upcoming school year.
Okay.
But if you just take all that, it's the same number. So it's nothing has happened. I do have some housekeeping, but I want to wait until everybody's done.
That means you have no further questions at this time.
No, I want to make sure the numbers are right, and I think you guys might need the break unless you just know them. I want to make sure and Justice Lukert got to some of this, but on capital outlay taxes levied, that's not within an equalization aid. That's just the 8, whatever the authority was within the 8 mills. That number's $216 million.
That I'll have to check. Yep.
And the amount of LOB taxes with no equalization is 610.
I think that's right.
I'm getting this off of Dale Dennis's spreadsheet that was attached to Exhibit D, I think it was, of the plaintiff's brief.
That's $610 million.
610 million. The equalization aid out of the block grant system was 450 million.
That's correct.
491. Yep. And the new equalization aid, not counting hold harmless or anything like that, is 367 million.
Yes, that should be about right.
Okay. But you do disagree with plaintiff's characterization that using the capital outlay equalization formula would be the same as if you equalized under the old formula, but only at 68.8 percentile.
Well, again, if you don't take into account the other factors that we think.
Are they right if you don't take in the other factors?
I didn't independently verify that, but they may well be.
I mean, the graph looked right, but
68.
you guys can talk about that.
Right.
If anybody's got a problem, let us know, because I just want to make sure we're playing off the same numbers.
Sure. Okay.
Any further questions? Thank you, counsel.
All right, thank you.
As I indicated at the outset, at this time, the court is in recess for 15 minutes. Proceed.
Alan Roop, John Robb, and Jessica Skladzian for the applicants. May it please the court. I think Groucho Marx said, before I talk, I have something important to say. I'd like to address directly the issue of eliminating the LOB as a remedy and having schools open. As of next Friday, under the continuing contract law, most of the money obliged to be paid by the districts is committed. The entire staff comes back on as of next Friday under the continuing contract law. Simply eliminating the LOB, severing that, would have a disastrous effect. When I finish with my discussion with you, I'll talk about some remedies that fall short of closing the schools or severing the LOB and having the same effect because of all the committed funds. And that will involve a discussion of what the three-judge panel suggested.
Counsel, during your presentation, will you be citing any authorities besides Groucho Marx?
Yes, Your Honor, I will. I wanted to get that point out and used him as a vehicle to do it. I apologize. The other thing that I think is important to respond to the state's arguments here are to focus on the backfill. Because, and I know council is looking at this while I talk, but the hole in the LOB that is created by siphoning out money to capital outlay and hold harmless, that hole is filled, but it's not equalized. And as a result, it creates all those red flags that we see in all your previous cases that indicate when you focus on funding public schools with property wealth, you got to be careful because of the huge variance in what mills do and the money you can raise for that purpose.
How much
Mr.
money are we talking about with that? I mean, I know there's an $83 million shift in the equalization fund, but council makes the point, I just don't know if it's right, that you couldn't access all of that 83 million because of caps and some districts being at their limits. Do we know how much new revenue raising authority is out there for next school year?
I still use the 83 number that he used. And if you add the special needs fund, the 2 million, you're talking between 83 and 85. So part of that goes to capital outlay. I think that number is about 20. And the remainder goes to the hold harmless. That's a 60 number.
But I want to be clear. Are you saying that local school districts, unequalized, have the ability, not regardless of whether they do it or not, or that they have the ability to go grab another $83 million of unequalized dollars?
Yes.
Okay.
Because I look at it like I look at the LOB like a tank, and they're siphoning off let's say 20% of the tank, and it goes to capital outlay, and it goes to hold harmless, and that budget authority, the tank, is still there, and they can, if they can convince their taxpayers to do it, they can raise the money to fill that tank back up. And that's part of the problem here, because when they fill that tank back up, some districts are going to be able to do it because a mill doesn't, it doesn't take a whole lot of mills to raise a whole bunch of money. Other districts are going to be pained, and they're really kind of in a Hobson's.
The way I saw the spreadsheet, though, was the wealthy districts, because they only get a little bit of the former equalization aid, didn't have a whole lot of extra revenue raising authority. That the real bulk of that 83 million, because it came out of the pockets of the poor districts, that we're really talking about potential revenue raising capacity with the poorer districts. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
So it's not, this isn't a whole bunch of new authority for a wealthier district, but it is a bunch of authority for a poor district if they can get to it.
I agree with that. And I think we set out some examples in our brief, Wichita and Olathe, to juxtapose that situation.
Help me understand kind of the same point you started your argument with. What is the practical effect of the calendar? I mean, is it realistic that in this fiscal year that backfilling can occur, given where we are, just in time and deadlines?
Realistically, well, first of all, I want to make sure the court understands that we are asking for implementation of your previous of the panel's order, and you're asking you to lift the stay. So we're talking about 2015, 16, and $17, and just not $17, or 2017.
But could backfilling, well, add to my question, can backfilling occur retrospectively? So answer that as well.
In a sense, well, it can't occur retroactively. So to answer your question, no, it can't.
So we're looking at FY17.
True, but that money could be backfilled, and it would apply to 2017. That's correct.
So that still can be accomplished under the deadlines?
I believe it
For-
can. With regard to the backfilling, because the districts aren't gonna have to go back and have elections. I mean, that would have had to have been a prediction they made some time ago and then had an election about something they didn't know was coming. But school boards could go back and raise that money because of after the law becomes implemented. So I think it can still happen that money can be raised locally, and the issues that I talked about with the wide-ranging disparities would occur. And I want to call particular attention.
Well, you said they could raise. Does anything compel them to raise it?
Well, in a poor district, it's a Hobson's choice.
Right.
They're going to either raise it and face the ire of going back to the taxpayers one more time, or again, to fund a statewide system locally, or they're going to bite the bullet and see the amount of hold harmless and capital outlay aid go down, because in the classroom, remember that capital outlay equalization aid is restricted to bricks and mortar. So in turn, it's paid to the general fund. With both of those are paid to the general fund, but the law was not changed. Capital outlay wasn't changed, and it's committed to bricks and mortar. So they actually take a decrease in the amount of classroom funding, because the hold harmless accounts for some of it. Capital outlay accounts for the rest of the money that they receive, but they can't spend that in the classroom.
Well, I guess the overall question is how's that a suitable provision for finances, for providing financial assistance to the districts when a district can opt not to do it? I mean, how's the state providing? They're not, are they?
No, they're not. If they decide not to do it, they just have to live with less equity money and less money. So the way the system works with the 83 to 85 amount of money being siphoned off to capital outlay and hold harmless puts particularly the poor districts in a terrible situation where where the equity is not available to them, and they can't plug the capital outlay money into the classroom. But the corollary of that is, because I'm going to make the argument to you now that it doesn't just simply take things back to where they were, because I think with the siphoning off, what they've done is simply equalize to the block grant, and we're back where we were in an earlier Gannon. But I would suggest to you that it's possible that it's now worse, because wealthier districts can use this as an opportunity to come in and get additional LOB money because they can easily refill that tank. So what has happened is they have, you can create equity by the Robin Hood method of clipping off the mountaintops and filling in the valleys, or you can simply level up from the valleys. But what they've done is created the ability for the mountaintops to get higher and the valleys to either stay the same or drop down some. So I think what they claim is an equity fix is not. And here's the thing that I want to make sure we're on track with, and that is that when I was here last year in November, the state's council said it is important to give the legislature careful guidance on what to do. And in your February of this year decision, that's what you did. And you indicated to them that there was what we've called, and the state's called, a safe harbor, where if they adopt what was basically 2506, House Bill 2506, that both capital outlay and LOB equalization would be satisfied in terms of the constitutional analysis of it. Well, they didn't take that careful guidance, and what they did was come up with a system that renamed the block grant into equalization, siphoning off from LOB into hold harmless and capital outlay. And as a result, we are in a situation in which, as I've indicated with this backfill, it's possible that things are now worse for the school districts.
And I'm still not sure I get that. So you're going to have to walk me through this a little bit. Let's just pick on Blue Valley because we do that in these cases in Johnson County. They lose about $2.4 million. That sound right under this system? And so I'm reading that to be that's their backfill number. But when I look at Wichita, they've got I think that, to me, they've got a larger number that they have the ability to backfill if they had equal assessed valuation and stuff like that. So I guess I'm still questioning whether this is a significant give to the wealthier districts, because it just doesn't seem like there's that much money at play. But you tell me where I'm wrong.
Take Olathe as an example. Olathe, because of the change in valuations and the price of oil in 2014, Olathe slipped down on the array of AVPP. And for a brief period of time, they were 82.1.
And their hold harmless now is 9.5 million.
Right. And they get 9.5 million in hold harmless. So it's like they're I guess it would be like they were on welfare for a little while and then won the lottery. But they also have available to them some additional funding. That capital outlay is restricted from the classroom, and they can backfill what LOB is remains. And we have a chart in our appendix that displays this. They can raise some amount of money to backfill. And the question is, how does that make it more equal? How does it achieve equity when a school district like Olathe can actually have access to more LOB dollars at a time where a school district like Kansas City, Kansas does not have that access because of the property wealth?
And from my looking at this spreadsheet, that Olathe appears to be an outlier because of this assessed valuation fluctuation.
Well, I'm not going
So this may be anecdotal as opposed to analytical off of the spreadsheets, all I'm getting at.
I may be putting too much emphasis on the Johnson County schools, but I think the principle is accurate, that with regard to the backfill, it falls to the poorer school districts with the Hobson's choice I explained to try to fill it. And that's to me, that's disequalizing, obviously, and creates an exacerbated problem. Okay, let me also suggest that with regard to these matters, the test that you have provided in Gannon is a three-part test. and not just at one part. So focusing just on the Pinner chart, I don't think satisfies the entire test, but I want to talk about Pinner's chart for a minute, and there are really two. There's the one that's Appendix B, and then there's the one that appears in the legislative record. But I think it's summarized. What I want to comment about the one in testimony is simply that averages hide the problem. Because Pinner chart uses a quintile analysis, it looks like only a gap range of 3 mils. But take a look at our Appendix L, and I think you'll see the range is larger, from a low of 4 to over 30. And that's what happens when you average by use of those quintiles. The other thing that I think is important to remember is they use 2013-14 as the starting point, and they take credit for increasing equalization under House Bill 2506, which they suggested to the trial court was the fix. You've identified that as the safe harbor. It wasn't fully funded, and they replaced it with the block grants in Senate Bill 7. With regard to his other chart, I would simply say that the comment that I would make is changing equalization in terms of our Appendix B, our chart. What we wanted to show was this backfill and the changing equalization in order to understand how that backfill works. Pinner has attributed to our Appendix B in his something other than what our intent was with our chart. So as I move to remedies, I want to talk just a second about what the state is proposing here. I liken it to they're trying to create a system that they now claim has diminished the equitable differences at a time where everybody knows what is needed in order to achieve what this court has suggested is constitutional under Article 6. And what they needed to do was basically 2506, adopt the safe harbor. But instead, they have started experimenting in different ways and then look backwards to try to suggest that they're claiming the equity is narrower, but it's basically trying to fix an airplane engine while the plane is flying. And my suggestion to this court in remedies is let's get this airplane on solid ground, and then they can experiment all they want. Let's get this on constitutional solid ground. And I think the way you do that is through adopting the court's previous, the trial, three-judge panel's previous remedy that you hit the pause button on with the stay. And what they suggested was exactly the safe harbor. And it'll take some updating of their order. But I think the legislature, and they have asked before, and you have given them what I would call a, not just a last chance, but a last chance to resolve this on constitutional grounds. And what we're faced with now is a situation in which all they did was come back and make it look like the block grants, equalizing to that, and not the constitutional framework that you have suggested needs to be done in terms of House Bill 2506. So I suggest you just simply lift the stay on the three-judge panel.
How's that going to work? The remedy they fashioned dealt with SB 7, and they made some pretty specific directions on what to strike and what to amend. So how do we apply that now to where we are now? And it applied just to 2015.
I think what you can do is lift the stay. So if you lift the stay, that money that would have been paid in 2015 is paid. And it is paid for 2016, and it is paid for 2017. And the reason that, and I know everybody's pops into their head cash basis law and so forth, but if you remember in the Gannon case, when we first filed it, we had a class action that we wanted certified on behalf of all schools in Kansas for 2010 capital outlay, which was in the statute but never funded. And we were told that that money was gone because, and you affirmed this, that money was gone because it was not encumbered. In the trial court, three-judge panel's decision, they specifically identify that money and they encumber it in their order. And that's what you stayed. So that money is encumbered as of 2015. And if you lift your stay, then we move forward with that, that order from 2015, the encumbered money. So it is then paid for 15, 16, and into 17.
What money's encumbered?
The money that is encumbered is the money that would basically be what should have been paid under 2506.
And do you have a figure for that?
I don't have it at hand. I can get it. So here were the options in terms of remedy. And I think we've been told that what we are advocating is threatening or causing the closure of the schools. I don't think you have to do that. I think this can be done by lifting the stay. There may be some need for the legislature to access additional resources in order to do that. But in respect for the judicial branch and the legislative branch, it may be by instruction, but you certainly have the power in this remedy phase as part of your constitutional powers to restrict other spending in state government until and unless the schools receive funds. And that may seem harsh, but I don't think because the schools are constitutionally protected in Article 6, I think the schools are like the courts, like voting, like jury trials, in the sense that there is a constitutional requirement that those services continue to operate. I say the same thing is true with the schools. Remember, and we cite it in our brief, there is a state statute that says schools take top priority, first priority. And with regard to what the Constitution provides and what the state law on school priority, spending for schools, provides, I think you're in a position to suggest that the legislature do what the people of Kansas have asked them to do in Article 6, and that is suitably fund the public schools. And I think you can even tell the legislature they need to do what they have said themselves they would do, which is to give the schools top priority in funding. And I think you do that by slicing and narrowing the spending for non-constitutionally protected entities until and unless the legislature provides additional resources. Because I think what we're witnessing is slowly a diminishment of funds available for public education. And that is contrary to what the will of the people is. And it's contrary to what the legislature has said in their own statutes they will do to fund public education.
Counsel, just so I'm clear on this particular remedy you're advocating, would you suggest that this court provide a specific amount to the legislature and say we're ordering you to pay this, and in the meantime you will be taking that same amount from entities that are not in the Constitution? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, yes, I am, because what I am suggesting is, as far as a number, you've already done that in terms of a suggestion to them that the safe harbor with the LOB equalization method that was in existence then, and with the capital outlay equalization method that was in existence then, that both of those passed constitutional muster. So you have in essence told them not necessarily a number, but what a constitutional system looks like. It's clear to me that when the state stands here and asks you for specific guidance, and then you give it to them, and they then operate, I'm going to disagree with good faith here, but they then operate in defiance or in a manner that shows they're not respecting the embedded notion of adequate funding in Article 6, then I think they need more guidance. And I think at that time you can tell them in the remedy phase exactly what that guidance should be.
And just so I'm clear, let's just use the figure X amount of dollars, that we would order the legislature to pay X amount of dollars, and we would further order them, for example, to take the money from KDOT
Well,
to pay that amount of money, because
I don't think, I mean, I would draw the line on that kind of specific controlling of expenditures. But I would say that in terms of I agree with you, the specific amount. So let's say X, that's what the safe harbor would have provided. You didn't do what we suggested you do by way of constitutionality, so we're going to give you the safe harbor as an order, what the trial court ordered. And then say to the legislature, as part of our remedial powers, we're restricting the payment of other government services because they're, especially those or only those that are not constitutionally protected and not protected by your own statute where you say schools have first priority, and fund the schools to X. That's what I'm suggesting.
again, just so I'm clear, you're suggesting we would leave it up to the legislature to decide who would be defunded in state
Sure.
government?
Sure. That would be their choice. I mean, they talk about that. This touches on adequacy, but they talk about giving schools a choice with the block grant, and that restricts the amount of money they have. And then they say you have the ability to choose what you're going to do. I don't see how your instructions could be criticized for telling them basically the same thing. If you don't want to raise resources, then you're going to have to fund what's in the Constitution, and fund what you've said you were going to fund as first priority. And you can choose what other services you don't want to fund.
And what sort of a calendar date would you suggest be used for that?
Well, the date I would suggest is, because these funds are encumbered, remember, for 15, 16, and 17, and we talked about all this at page 30 of our brief, but I would suggest that in terms of timing, the sooner the better. I mean, this case started in 2010, and it seems like we keep coming here every once in a while. And I would suggest that the legislature just doesn't seem to be getting it. And rather than try to fix the plane while it's in flight, I think we ground the plane and let them experiment all they want, but pay what is obliged to be paid back through 2015 and shut off whatever. I mean, they can make the choices. They can't with regard to what the people of Kansas said we want funded in the Kansas Constitution. And they certainly have to follow their own statute saying we're going to give schools first priority. But I think it is well within reason to suggest that they can fund the schools as the Constitution requires. For fiscal year 15, the encumbered amounts were $54 million. Fiscal year 16, $71 million. Fiscal year 17, 38, and it's the 38 million that needs appropriated. And again, that's at page 30 of our brief. You know, I went back.
While we're on this, let me
Sure.
interrupt you a little bit, maybe a lot. When House Bill 2731 was floated out there, that's the one that funded at the 81.2 percentile level, and some people won, some people lost with that. That only added about $14.5 million, I believe. So what I'm trying to say here is this: the safe harbor is really a $14.5 million problem, right? Because that's what House Bill 2731 would have cost.
That's probably right.
And so now I'm trying to figure out, now that we're here, now that we have a law, what's the size of the problem? And so is it more than 14.5? I mean, is it 14.5 plus the 83 million backfill? Is that the problem? You know, they've aggravated the problem, if you will, with that little provision, but still, is this what we're talking about, or is there a bigger problem that I'm not grasping?
Well, I would add the numbers that I just read to you back into the problem.
I know you want to go get that money, but I'm looking forward, not backward, and you don't concede that, but for purposes of for next school year, the scope of the problem, is it the 14 plus the 83, or is it more or less?
Well, it is the 14 plus the 83, but it's the potential with the backfill to further disequalize. So I think just suggesting that, I mean, I wouldn't want to see the solution just be the 14. I'd like to see the solution include what has been moved out of LOB into the hold harmless and capital outlay.
Counsel had criticized your clients for not testifying in support of 2731. I can understand why you didn't show up for the Senate bill, since it took money from everybody, but 2731 was a pure safe harbor provision.
Well,
Why weren't your guys there to push that along?
I think if you look through the proposed legislation, you'll see that the timing of this was difficult to analyze before anybody testified. There was what I call poison pills. There was cannibalization of the Extraordinary Needs Fund, which is essential to the block grant bill. Another bill cut the base and destroyed adequacy in the district's views. So I would suggest with the poison pill in that legislation, that's the reason that you didn't see our folks show up and talk about that.
If we look at, now that we have this new severability clause, and this is the same set of questions I posed to Professor McAllister, now that we have what I would call a garden variety severability provision, and we're looking at potentially taking out the entire LOB, both the fundraising authority and the equalization. Going through the typical test for severability, I want to ask you both of those two factors. Number one, do the plaintiffs believe the legislature would have passed class without LOB? And then number two, regardless of what they would have intended, can class operate effectively and efficiently without LOB?
My answer to the first part of that question is, and I have the same history you have in school finance, and I remember LOB being initially adopted for extras. And then
I don't agree with that, but go ahead.
But then at some point, the LOB became essential to the operation. So my first answer would be, I don't think the legislature could have passed class without the LOB component. And the second part of your question with regard to the severability, it is severable, but it has disastrous consequences. And I would suggest some other method that gives the legislature more specific guidance than basically shutting down the schools with the elimination of the LOB. If there are no other questions, I think
I do have a question
Okay.
on your lift the stay and go back for 3 years. As a practical matter, what will the schools do with that money? For instance, 2015, the $54 million, that school year has gone. Supplies have been purchased and consumed, wages have been paid. What's the practical effect of giving them $54 million to operate the 2015 fiscal year when that year has been completed?
It may very well be put into their reserve and actually be a savings to the taxpayers, because that money would then be subtracted from what would be needed in future years. So in terms of, certainly they can't go back and retroactively spend that money, but in terms of whether they're entitled to that money or not, since it is encumbered, they are entitled to it.
They can't retroactively lower the mill levy
Right.
for that year. It would be for future
Correct.
budgets, is what you're saying.
Correct.
Yeah.
Only because I think the legislature has not lived up to their constitutional responsibilities. I just, in closing, would tell you that I went back and checked their oath of office. And this would be a quote from somebody more authoritative than Groucho Marx. Their oath of office suggests that we and each of us do solemnly swear or affirm that we will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Kansas and faithfully discharge the duties of the office of the Senator or House for the State of Kansas, so help me God. The Kansas Constitution requires them to do what they have not done. And I would suggest that in Article 6, Section 6, when you look at that article, this court who has a very similar oath, has an obligation to the people of Kansas to make this situation constitutional. A positive duty, as we described in our brief, a positive duty to do for the people of Kansas what the legislature has not done. That's all I
Counsel,
have.
before you retire, I wanted you to go.
Before I sit down, I'm not going to retire.
Opposing counsel had given us some severance remedies, and I just wanted to make sure that you felt you had responded to each of his individual remedies in your prior answers. For example, one remedy was to use the severance provision in the law, and we would simply strike the part that talks about supplemental general state aid coming from LOB.
I have adequately, I think,
Okay.
responded to that. We don't think that's a good idea. We think there are other alternatives.
And also to go further and sever not only the aid, but also the LOB revenue generating authority. Have you answered that?
I think I have answered that.
All right, very well. Do we have any further questions?
I would like to see what you think about a question we ask your opposing counsel, and that is, how do we evaluate the record that was before the legislature? And in particular, that probably would be Mr. Penner's charts. This remedy stage presents a unique situation. We don't have findings of fact. And do you have a test or a standard that would be applied in this situation?
I think when you said we are in the remedy phase, that would be my answer. Based on the order Justice Nuss read before we started this proceeding, the burden is on the state. And if the Penner chart, which as we've discussed, is not persuasive authority for what they want to use it for, and it demonstrates what we have responded in our brief, our problems with it, then that's the test. If they haven't shown you that the Penner chart proves that they are equitable or achieved equity, then I don't think it needs to be returned to a trial court to make that determination. The test is whether or not you accept it. And it's clear from my analysis of it and looking at it, and as we've explained in our brief, we don't accept it and set forth the reason. So I don't know that there's anything more I can say than that. It needs to be clear and convincing, basically, and it's not.
And you get to clear and convincing because of the remedy stage.
Yeah, because of the remedy stage in your previous order.
Any more questions? Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
We'll reserve 15 minutes for rebuttal.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, I would like to begin by responding to a few questions that I was unable to answer when I was first up here. I think perhaps all posed by Justice Biles. I believe the capital outlay that the districts generate, the estimate is about $216 million, so I agree with that. On the 68.8 on the chart in terms of the equalization, the one thing I'd say is that is starting with an assumption of 20 mils. So we don't know if you went 25 or you went 15, where it would fall. So the chart as built, if you read on that left side, it says 20 mils. So that's an assumption in the chart, which could change that number. And my understanding is that if the districts raise LOB in the next few months, so going forward, so they have ability under their cap to raise additional funds, that will be equalized by the legislature, that those numbers would be presented to the legislature in the 2017 session to then appropriate to equalize. That's my understanding.
And on the latter point, we only have to know that we've heard that one before, and it didn't happen.
And I don't vote
but
on
that's
equalizing, but yes.
But it's eligible for equalization, and
yes.
so it may or may not, I mean,
Absolutely. I mean, it is not precluded.
without
from
changing the law would.
It is
assume that
eligible
would
for
be equalized.
equalization.
And it would be equalized at the capital outlay formula basis, the
Correct.
reduced basis.
Correct. You know, and I would say, my colleague, Mr. Root, likes to pull out a particular district, and I think you're right that it's anecdotal rather than analytical what would happen. I mean, part of the reason we presented the if you will, the alternate version of Mr. Pinner's, the graph, or taking the plaintiffs and changing things, if you look at a number of those high-end districts are at their cap. Not all of them, but they are. So they don't have any ability to backfill by raising LOB because they're already capped. So that is one factor. Also, in terms of, you know, I guess one thing I would say is that because the caps hold down the wealthier districts, and yet you can come up with a wealthy district, I don't know if it's Shawnee Mission or Olathe, that did actually fall under the 81.2 at one point, because to me, again, that just shows that there's nothing magical about the 81.2, a district that many would think of as pretty wealthy, and nonetheless got LOB equalization aid. Again, the 81.2 is not a constitutional requirement. Also, I don't think I understand, and certainly don't agree with Mr. Roop's point about simply lifting the stay on the panel decision. I see at least two fundamental problems with that. First of all, the only thing the panel was trying to encumber was capital outlay equalization. It was not encumbering LOB funds. And second of all, I don't know that there's anything left to encumber. I mean, for two reasons. One, when this court stayed the panel's order, nothing legally would be encumbered, and the money's spent. I mean, what was appropriated for 15 is gone. So there isn't some pot of money simply sitting there that the court would just say, lift the stay, and now that money flows to the districts. There was a question, Justice Wells, I think you asked about the gap if the legislature had taken the 27-31 approach. And my understanding is the total gap, capital outlay and LOB, was roughly $37 to $38 million, with 14.5 being the LOB piece and the remainder being capital outlay. And so no matter how you look at it, though, the 83 is not a complete gap here in the sense that part of that was changed to other equalization aid, so there's an offset at a minimum there on capital outlay.
But the conclusion from that would be that the revenue raising authority that's generated by this law may not be 83 million, but there's still something out there.
There's
that's
something
got
out there,
this
and I
lower
don't know that we know exactly what that is. I don't know if there's an analysis of that. Again, there are some districts that would not have any ability because they are at the cap. Many obviously would have some ability, but we don't know. And again, that would be eligible for equalization if in fact they chose to do that. One thing I'd like to sort of going to Justice Lukert's question just a moment ago, I mean, at the end of Montoy, the court does say to decide if there's a cure in Montoy, we look at the legislative record. We are not going to bring in lots of other facts or send it back for a trial. And at the end of Montoy, the court said we look at what the legislature had in front of it, and that sort of brings me to where I more or less like to conclude. Looking at that legislative record, the legislature reasonably concluded it was going to result in the lowest mill levy disparity in recent years. That's a cure, or at a minimum, the language of Montoy substantially complies with the equity requirement under Article 6. Again, at least for fiscal year 17. If the court reaches that conclusion, then the equity aspect can be over for now and we can proceed to adequacy. If for some reason the court does not find that equity has been achieved, then I would again urge the court to take the narrowest approach possible in terms of remedy. Certainly there's not a compelling reason to shut down the schools altogether. And one thing I have not mentioned is actually closing Kansas schools could create the state some problems under federal law as well. We mentioned that in our brief. We didn't spell it out, but I can give you a few examples. Under special ed, federal laws require maintenance of effort by the state. If we're not operating schools, we're probably not maintaining effort. Under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we have to provide a free and appropriate public education. Again, if there's no schools operating, we may not be doing that. And there's some other federal programs in which Kansas participates where that could be an issue if the schools were closed down altogether. As I said earlier, the one thing that seems to me absolutely clear as a constitutional matter is that zero funding might be equitable, but it cannot be adequate. So again, shutting down the entire funding system necessarily means the Constitution is not being complied with.
Well, along those lines, in Gannon too, we gave the warning to the legislature that any cure they came up with that had to demonstrate that it's capable of meeting the equity requirements of Article 6 while not running afoul of the adequacy requirement. So it seems to me that if we would sever all of the LOB, we would arguably be violating our own warning to the legislature, doing what we told the legislature they couldn't do.
Arguably, but if you struck down the entire funding system, I don't think it's even arguable. You would be creating a system that is necessarily inadequate. And I'd also say shutting down the entire LOB operation is not the state's suggested or preferred remedy, but it's preferable to shutting down the entire system.
The difference is, I guess, being proactive and just being directive. If we declare the entire scheme unconstitutional, we're not shutting down the schools. There's just no mechanism for which the schools can be funded. If we sever LOB, then we're being proactive and we're rewriting the legislation.
With an explicit severability clause that says it's the legislature's intent that if some aspect is unconstitutional, it may be severed. The legislature does not want the schools to close. I mean, that appears more than once in the act, that was a clear intent and purpose of the legislature. So in that sense, Justice Johnson, I'd say they have invited a lesser, what I would call a lesser remedy over the ultimate remedy, if you will, of shutting down the entire system. And that's a distinct contrast from SB 7.
But it's not a distinct concept from this garden variety severability clause, because I was going back and I found a case from 1958 from this court that said the fact that you have a severability clause or don't have a severability clause really doesn't matter. So I guess I read that to say I don't care how many times they say it in the law that they really want to do it. The analytical test remains the same, and it's those two factors that we've gone through before.
Right, Your Honor, although I don't think if with all due respect, if this court said it doesn't matter what the legislature says, I would take issue with that. I think it does matter. I've always understood severability to be in large part trying to ascertain legislative intent. But I think your point gets to, well, if the system cannot operate without this provision, then perhaps there would not have been intent to have that result. But to me, that's a different question than saying the severability clause doesn't matter at all. I think what they're saying, if there's any way possible to adopt a remedy short of striking the entire system, that is the legislature's intent and preference here.
The presence of the severability clause is not dispositive of
It's
the
not
issue.
dispositive. I agree this court has said that and other courts have said that, but it is certainly an important factor. I mean, I think there are a couple of older Kansas Supreme Court cases that have said in a fairly unusual circumstance that even though there was a severability clause, the provision we're striking really makes it impossible for this statute to work, so it's really not severable. But I don't think that's true here. It's not impossible for the funding system to continue even if the court is to strike parts of it. So, I would urge the court to go for the narrowest remedy possible. I do not think ordering the legislature basically to take money from other agencies is a real choice. It's certainly an unprecedented kind of remedy for this court to adopt, and it's not really a choice. It doesn't become a choice by saying, well, you decide if it's prisons or roads or what it is, but you've got to take this much from somebody. That's not really a choice for the legislature. I think that crosses the line into coercion, which generally we would try to avoid as a matter of separation of powers. At the end of the day, I would ask the court to conclude that the HB 2655, in the circumstances we have for this coming year, at a minimum substantially complies with the equity requirement. If the court disagrees, please adopt the narrowest remedy possible using the 4 principles identified earlier to formulate or craft any remedy. And ultimately, I do hope the court will reject the plaintiff's invitation to engage in what, frankly, is lawless and unprecedented action. Instead, to do as this court generally has done and act with caution and judicial restraint, to adopt remedies that will protect our students, protect our schools, respect the separation of powers, and our Constitution, which is not just Article 6, but also Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3. And ultimately, to as best it can, protect the interests of all of Kansas in this context. So unless there are further questions.
I did have a question,
Okay.
and this goes back to the issue of severability. And you touched on this in your initial presentation. I just want to go back to that. But it was pretty clear that class had a distinct non-severability clause. Would you agree with me?
Yes, absolutely.
And it's equally clear that a year later, the legislature said, we are repealing the non-severability and we are expressly saying the provisions of this act should be considered as severable. With that as the factual predicate, tell me your view as to how we are supposed to interpret that when both talked about LOB.
Right. Well, I guess the way I would interpret that is that the later expression of legislative intent should control, so that the legislature that passed HB 2655 absolutely knew what was in class and what it did and how it changed things and so forth, but made a very conscious and deliberate decision to say that notion that we put in class, that any striking of a provision should be non-severable and therefore the entire law fails, is no longer our view of the situation. So I think the later expression of legislative intent in this context, because it's so close in time and it's so clear, should control. I could imagine a circumstance where it's separated by decades or something, that might be different. But in this context, the later expression of legislative intent should control rather than the former.
Very well, thank you. Any further questions?
How do you address opposing counsel's argument that Article 6 sets up a positive duty?
Well, Your Honor, initially the state disagreed with that, but this court said it does create a positive duty. And I'll accept that as where the law is, but it still doesn't mandate particular results. Yes, there is a requirement to make suitable provision for finance of the schools. What we're arguing about here is whether that has been accomplished, but the legislature still has put $4.5 billion in the public schools. This is not a situation where the legislature said we do not provide for public schools. That would be a blatant, I think, violation of Article 6. Now we're arguing at the margins. Exactly how does this system have to look? Exactly what happens at the end of the day? But the legislature has not ignored its constitutional duty. And even with a constitutional duty, we also have other articles that make clear the roles and responsibilities and powers of each of the branches. And so each of the branches needs to operate within its sphere of power and authority, even if enforcing a positive duty as opposed to a negative duty. So I can accept that it's a positive duty, but it really doesn't change in my sense, I guess, twofold, Justice Johnson. One, the legislature has not refused to fund public schools. $4.5 billion, it's the lion's share of the state budget. Plaintiffs wish it was more, and we can argue about that, but it's not an abdication. And second of all, in terms of the court's response, if it finds flaws in the way the legislature has responded, that needs to be done within the traditional powers that Article 3 gives. And plaintiffs seem to suggest that somehow Article 6 trumps everything else. And there's no evidence that when the people of Kansas amended the Constitution to include Article 6, they intended it to trump everything else, so that the courts could order appropriations or do anything they wanted as long as it related to Article 6. There's no evidence of that. And that would be such a break with tradition and 200 years of American understanding that you would have expected that to have been explicit if that was intended by Article 6. Unless there are further questions, I would thank the court for its time, attention, and your careful consideration of this case.
Any further questions? All right, thank you,
Right, thank
counsel.
you.
We thank you both for your arguments this morning. The court will take this matter under advisement. At this